Picture this. October 24th, 1428. Thomas Montacute, the English Earl of Salisbury, peers through an iron grate at the Tourelles fortress. A rogue cannonball from across the river slams into the stone window frame. It doesn't hit him. The ricochet does. Jagged iron and shattered stone blast directly into his face, tearing out his eye and shearing away his skull. The Grand English war machine loses its most brilliant tactician to a blind, lucky shot. His agonizing 8-day death plunges the Siege of Orléans into a chaotic, merciless war of attrition. Official military logs from 1428 bury this breakdown under neat lists of troop movements, ignoring the sheer panic that infected the high command. How does this random, gruesome death pave the way for a 17-year-old illiterate girl to shatter the greatest army in Europe? Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. France was bleeding to death. Orléans was the final barricade. If it fell, the English would swallow the south, and Dauphin Charles VII would lose his crown. The royal treasury was a joke. Financial records from early 1429 show Charles was entirely bankrupt, scraping together coins just to feed his courtiers, let alone fund a rescue army. The English didn't have the manpower to build a solid wall around the city. Instead, they built a chokehold of wooden bastilles, planning to starve Orléans out. We know exactly how horrific it got inside those walls. The Journal du Siège d'Orléans, a daily survival log kept by a resident, captures the terror of that freezing winter. The anonymous chronicler wrote, "There was such a great scarcity of food that a single pig cost 30 gold crowns, and we were forced to eat the very dogs that guarded our doors. They were trapped in an icy cage. Despair paralysed the French military elite. They sat behind their walls, freezing, waiting for the starvation to finish them off. They needed an absolute anomaly to break the siege." Building a wooden fortress in the dead of winter requires timber, iron, and a terrifying amount of human calories. The English army couldn't simply snap their fingers and throw a solid stone wall around Orléans. They hacked down every surrounding forest, stripping the French countryside bare to construct a suffocating ring of bastilles. These were massive, fortified wooden towers connected by freezing, muddy trenches. They weren't elegant castles. They were brutal, functional killing zones designed to choke the oxygen out of the city. Managing military logistics in the 15th century was an absolute nightmare. Keeping an army of several thousand men fed and armed while sitting motionless outside a hostile city rapidly drained the English treasury. Their supply lines stretched perilously thin, winding all the way back to Normandy and Paris over hostile terrain. Modern movies often paint sieges as glorious, clean affairs, featuring noble knights charging massive walls. The grim reality was dysentery. It was typhus. English soldiers shivering in their makeshift earthworks died of disease, frostbite, and exposure at a staggering rate. Inside Orléans, the horror became systemic. Municipal ledgers from 1428, specifically the Comte de Fortress, track the desperate economics of survival. The price of a single loaf of wheat bread skyrocketed by 400% within 3 months. Desperate citizens systematically dismantled their own homes, tearing out structural wooden beams just to fuel fires and survive the freezing nights. When the municipal grain silos ran empty, they slaughtered the cavalry horses. When the horses vanished, stray cats and dogs disappeared from the cobblestone streets. We have a blunt, highly accurate assessment from medieval military historian Kelly de Vries regarding the sheer futility of this standoff. The English had too few men to take the city by storm, and the French had too little courage to sally out and break the ring. It degenerated into a gruesome, freezing, staring contest. An underground war erupted in the literal mud. French and English sappers dug collapsing, waterlogged tunnels beneath the defensive walls, desperately trying to undermine fortifications or intercept the enemy's mining efforts. Men stabbed each other to death in pitch-black, suffocating dirt, fighting blindly for mere inches of subterranean ground. Chivalry was entirely absent. Sir William Glassdale took command of the English siege after Salisbury's gruesome death. He was a hardened, ruthless veteran who despised the French resistance. Standing on the captured Tourelles bridge, looking out at the starving defenders on the opposite bank, Glassdale screamed a chilling promise across the river. "When I enter Orléans, I will have the entire population put to the sword, sparing neither women nor children." That wasn't some theatrical villain speech. It represented the strict military doctrine of the era. If a besieged city refused terms of surrender and forced the attacking army to suffer through a miserable winter, the punishment upon capture was total annihilation. Orléans was isolated. The Dauphin Charles, paralysed by crushing debt and endless court paranoia, offered zero salvation. The city's defenders were practically freezing skeletons gripping rusted swords. They didn't need another cautious tactical genius to save them. They needed a psychological shock so violent it would shatter the paralysis of an entire nation. Forget the delicate, haloed saint gazing peacefully toward heaven in Renaissance paintings. The girl who rode out of Domremy was a hardened, illiterate farm labourer. She spent her childhood pulling ploughs, tending livestock, and watching her village burn during enemy raids. Joan was deeply religious, but she possessed a terrifying, uncompromising edge. If you examine genuine Joan of Arc history, specifically the surviving 1431 trial of condemnation transcripts, you do not find a gentle mystic. You find a fiercely intelligent fanatic who verbally battered the most educated theologians in Europe. Getting an audience with the French Dauphin was physically and economically nearly impossible for a peasant. Chinon Castle sat over 300 miles away. The intervening territory swarmed with hostile Burgundian patrols, English raiding parties, and starving deserters who would kill a traveller for their boots. A teenage girl travelling alone faced guaranteed capture or death. She needed funding, a horse, and an armed military escort. She marched into the neighbouring garrison town of Vaucouleurs and harassed the local commander, Robert de Baudricourt, for months. He repeatedly told his men to slap her and send her back to her parents. She simply refused to leave. Her sheer aggressive persistence eventually broke his resolve. He gave her a sword, a horse, and a small escort. To survive the journey, Joan sheared her hair short and strapped herself into men's riding clothes. This was a brutal logistical necessity to prevent sexual assault while sleeping in muddy camps surrounded by hardened soldiers. It absolutely blows my mind that veteran medieval killers looked at a ranting 17-year-old girl and decided she was their best strategic asset. The knight John de Metz was one of the first to break under her sheer force of will. Stunned by her absolute certainty, he swore an oath to protect her and asked when she wanted to depart for Chinon. Her recorded reply was razor sharp. Rather today than tomorrow, and tomorrow than later. She abandoned all talk of peaceful negotiation. She intended to wage a war of annihilation. Upon approaching Orléans, she dictated a letter to the English commanders. It remains one of the most arrogant, chilling documents of the 15th century. She demanded total surrender, declaring, "Yield to the Maid the keys of all the good towns you have taken and violated in France. I am sent here by God the King of Heaven, body for body, to drive you out of all France." Military historian Stephen W. Ritchie summarised this insane strategic pivot perfectly. The army's leaders were desperate enough to try anything. A peasant girl demanding to lead an army was absurd, but every rational military strategy had already failed. The French elite had tried logic. Logic lost them half the country. Now they were ready to weaponize faith. "200 miles south of the slaughter at Orléans, the supposed King of France hid inside the fortress of Chinon. Charles VII was 26 years old, disinherited by his own parents, and ruling over a shattered fragment of a kingdom. His enemies mocked him with the title King of Bourges. His court functioned as a snake pit of paranoid advisors constantly whispering conspiracy theories. The Dauphin spent his days brooding, terrified of assassination, and completely paralysed by indecision. The logistics of his regime were comically pathetic. The royal treasury did not just run a deficit, it was physically empty. Financial ledgers maintained by his royal treasurer, Aimon Raguier, show the king surviving entirely on loans from his mother-in-law, Yolande of Aragon. The poverty reached absurd, humiliating levels. According to contemporary chronicles, an official royal shoemaker actually repossessed a newly made pair of boots directly from Charles because the monarch literally could not scrape together the coins to pay for them. He owed his Scottish mercenary bodyguards years of back pay. You cannot break a massive siege when your own soldiers are actively threatening to mutiny over bread money. British historian Juliet Barker captures the Dauphin's mental state perfectly. Charles was a chronic depressive, crippled by a sense of his own illegitimacy and incapable of decisive military action. He was completely ready to give up. In a moment of absolute despair, Charles confided his final cowardly plan to his inner circle. "I intend to abandon my kingdom and seek refuge in Scotland or Spain." Then, a teenage farm girl wearing men's clothes walked into his castle, claiming the King of Heaven sent her to crown him. The famous meeting at Chinon usually gets depicted as a magical revelation. Charles disguised himself in plain clothes and hid in a crowded room of heavily jewelled nobles. Joan marched directly past the decoys, walked right up to the ragged Dauphin, bowed, and declared him the true king. What mainstream history often skips is the intense clinical paranoia that immediately followed. Charles didn't just fall to his knees and hand over the military codes. He strongly suspected an elaborate Burgundian assassination plot or literal demonic possession. Before he authorised a single copper coin for her campaign, he ordered a highly invasive physical examination. He handed Joan over to a panel of noblewomen, led by Queen Yolande, to strip her bare and inspect her body to verify her virginity. In 15th century theology, a virgin could not physically form a pact with the devil. Once she survived the physical exam, the church took over. A panel of elite theologians dragged her to Poitiers and interrogated her for 3 solid weeks. They threw every complex theological trap at her, hoping she would slip up and reveal herself as a heretic. She crushed them. Her mind operated like a steel trap, easily dodging their academic ambushes. Only after the smartest, most educated men in France admitted they could not outdebate an illiterate teenager did Charles finally place his very last chips on her. He authorised the relief convoy. The weapon was loaded. It was time to march on Orléans. Moving a medieval army is essentially herding thousands of heavily armed angry men alongside a massive slow-moving meat market. Joan departed Blois in late April 1429 with over 3,000 soldiers and a desperately needed convoy of grain wagons and live cattle. The logistics of pushing this unwieldy mob through spring mud while dodging enemy patrols were agonizing. Joan wanted to march directly onto the north bank of the Loire River and smash straight into the main English fortifications. The veteran French commanders quietly ignored her. They thought she was a useful religious mascot, not a tactician. They safely guided the army down the southern bank, arriving opposite Orléans but separated from the starving city by a wide, rushing river. Joan was absolutely furious. When Jean de Dunois, the battlefield commander of the Orléans garrison, rode across the river to greet his supposed saviour, he expected a compliant symbol of hope. He found a raging teenager. She verbally ripped into the most seasoned veterans in French military history for avoiding a direct fight. The city was starving, and the relief grain sat stranded on the south bank. The only way to transport the massive cargo into Orléans was by loading it onto shallow draft barges and sailing upstream. There was a critical geographical problem. The river current was incredibly strong, and the wind was blowing fiercely in the exact wrong direction. The French boats sat motionless at the docks. Every hour they waited on the exposed riverbank gave the English time to mobilise a slaughter. Dunois attempted to calm her down, explaining the meteorological reality. Joan stared him down and delivered a chilling response that Dunois himself recorded under oath years later. "I bring you better help than ever came to you from any soldier or any city. It is the help of the King of Heaven." What happened next defied every law of probability. According to sworn eyewitness testimony from the 1456 nullification trial The heavy winds blowing down the Loire abruptly stopped. A moment of dead calm followed. Then, the wind violently reversed direction, blowing straight upstream. The heavy linen sails snapped full. The grain barges effortlessly glided against the current, slipping right past the English artillery positions. The English gunners simply stood on their wooden earthworks, paralysed by the sudden weather anomaly, watching their 6-month starvation strategy sail away. Joan crossed the river and rode into Orléans on the night of April 29th. The city erupted in sheer hysteria. Starving citizens crushed together in the narrow pitch-black streets just to touch her horse. In the absolute chaos, a frantic resident carrying a torch accidentally set Joan's pennant on fire. She didn't flinch or panic. She spurred her warhorse forward and ruthlessly crushed the flames out with her bare armoured hands. Historian Régine Pernoud captured the absolute whiplash of this moment perfectly. The psychological reversal was instantaneous. She transformed a paralysed, terrified population into a mob that believed itself invincible. The shivering skeletons of Orléans were no longer waiting to die. They were ready to kill. May 4th, 1429. The veteran French commanders still viewed Joan as a mere political mascot. They refused to accept her as a frontline tactical leader. When Dunois and the other generals decided to launch a surprise attack on the isolated English fortress of Saint-Lô, they deliberately left her behind. They assumed a teenage girl had no place in the brutal meat grinder of an infantry assault. Their arrogance cost them dearly. Their uncoordinated attack immediately hit a brick wall and began collapsing into a chaotic slaughter. Joan was asleep in her city lodgings. Her squire, Jean d'Aulon, recorded the sheer panic of what happened next in his official testimony. She suddenly jolted awake, breathless and furious. She grabbed d'Aulon and screamed, "In God's name, my council has told me I must go against the English. The blood of our people is flowing. Bring me my arms!" She was so frantic she refused to wait for her squires to strap the heavy steel plates to her legs. She bolted into the street, leaped onto her horse, and spurred it at full gallop toward the eastern gate. The French assault at Saint-Lô was turning into a tactical disaster. Saint-Lô stood as a heavily fortified stone church on high ground, dominating the surrounding terrain. The English defenders easily repelled the disorganised French infantry, shooting them down from the parapets and pushing the survivors back into the muddy ditches. The French forces broke under the relentless arrow fire. They were actively retreating toward the city when Joan collided with the front line. She refused to issue calm orders from the safety of the rear guard. She spurred her horse directly into the kill zone, violently waving her white banner in the air. The psychological impact of seeing a 17-year-old girl charge headfirst into a storm of English arrows completely shattered the French retreat. The sheer humiliation of watching a teenage farm labourer outbrave veteran mercenaries triggered a wave of absolute fanaticism. The retreating French soldiers turned around screaming and hurled themselves furiously at the English walls. Military historian Kelly de Vries pinpoints this exact clash as a massive rupture in French military strategy. Joan possessed only one tactical doctrine, but it was exactly what the French lacked: an unrelenting, hyper-aggressive frontal assault. They completely overran the fortifications. The French infantry swarmed the barricades and slaughtered the English garrison in a frenzy of pent-up rage. Over 100 English soldiers were hacked to pieces. A handful of survivors desperately locked themselves inside the church bell tower. The French simply set the structure on fire, burning them alive or cutting them down as they jumped from the smoke. Joan reportedly wept at the sight of the butchered corpses and immediately demanded priests to confess the dying enemy. She hated the suffering, yet she never once hesitated to unleash the violence. For the first time in 6 months, the French had stopped cowering behind walls. They were finally the predators. The French army was riding a wave of psychotic confidence after the massacre at Saint-Lô. Joan directed this massive momentum directly at the fortified monastery of Les Augustins. Taking it meant the French infantry had to sprint across wide open ground. This forced them to face the most terrifying asymmetric weapon of the medieval world, the English warbow. A seasoned English archer could loose up to 12 heavy armour-piercing arrows a minute. These were not the flimsy hunting bows you see in Hollywood movies. They were 160-pound U-monsters. Drawing one required so much physical torque that archaeologists today can identify the skeletons of English archers just by looking at their warped, overdeveloped shoulder bones. The logistics of supplying these archers were staggering. The English crown shipped millions of arrows across the Channel in massive wooden tons, requiring a constant, highly vulnerable supply chain. When a hardened bodkin point arrow hit a French knight at a sprint, it easily defeated early plate armour. It punched right through the steel, splintered the ribs, and buried itself deep in the lungs. The sheer kinetic force knocked grown men backward into the mud. You drowned in your own blood while your comrades trampled over you. On May 6th, the French charged the barricades at Les Augustins. The sky immediately turned black. A localised hailstorm of razor-sharp steel shredded the first wave of French attackers. Men screamed as heavy shafts pinned their feet to the earth or punched straight through their steel visors. The horrific trauma broke the French vanguard. They panicked and scrambled desperately back toward the safety of the river. Joan was recovering from stepping on a rusted iron caltrip earlier that day. Watching her soldiers break, she ignored the bleeding in her foot, grabbed her standard, and rode furiously into the collapsing front line. Military historian Francisco Garcia Fitz describes the psychological warfare at play here perfectly. The English archers relied on the terror of their volleys to break enemy formations before hand-to-hand combat began. Joan nullified that terror by offering a physical focal point of absolute fearlessness. She screamed at her fleeing men and rallied the notorious mercenary captain La Hire. Together they physically turned the terrified mob around and violently slammed back into the English positions. The French infantry overran the archers before they could draw their sidearms. The slaughter inside the monastery was absolute. English defenders were hacked to pieces among the burning pews and shattered stone altars. The French took 0 prisoners. When the sun finally set, the English death grip around Orléans was bleeding profusely. Only one massive fortress remained standing between the city and total freedom, the Tourelles. Joan knew the final assault would require an ocean of blood. The night before the attack, she dictated a chilling prophecy to her confessor, Jean Pasquerel, stating exactly what would happen to her. "Rise tomorrow very early and keep always near me, for tomorrow I shall have much to do, and tomorrow blood will leave my body above my breast." The Tourelles fortress was a medieval nightmare. It stood as a massive twin-towered stone gatehouse anchoring the southern end of the bridge into Orléans. It was heavily fortified with deep trenches, earthworks, and overlapping fields of crossfire. Taking it required infantry to scale vertical stone walls under a continuous downpour of boiling oil, heavy rocks, and armour-piercing arrows. The logistics of the assault were suicidal. French engineers had to physically drag heavy wooden scaling ladders across an open killing field, littered with the rotting corpses from the previous day's combat. On the morning of May 7th, the French launched a massive frontal assault. The fighting was incredibly brutal and entirely gridlocked. For hours, the desperate English defenders relentlessly repelled wave after wave of French infantry, violently shoving their ladders backward and crushing the attackers in the dry moat below. By early afternoon, French morale was actively collapsing. The assault was failing. Joan grabbed a scaling ladder herself and personally led a charge against the eastern bulwark. As she climbed, an English archer lined up a shot from the parapet above. The heavy bodkin arrow struck her perfectly in the unarmoured gap between her helmet and her chest plate. It pierced deep into her flesh, tearing through the muscle between her neck and shoulder. The sheer kinetic impact knocked her off the ladder, plunging her violently into the trench below. The English defenders erupted in euphoric celebration. The terrifying French witch was finally dead. Panic swept the French lines as soldiers frantically dragged her heavily bleeding body out of the kill zone. Her confessor Jean Pasquerel witnessed the sheer terror firsthand and later recorded her exact reaction under oath. Panicked soldiers desperately offered to apply pagan magical charms to the wound to stop the bleeding. Joan refused outright, stating furiously, "I would rather die than do a thing which I know to be a sin." She demanded olive oil and lard. With her own bare hands, she gripped the bloody wooden shaft of the arrow and violently ripped the steel barb out of her own flesh. The physical pain must have been absolutely blinding. She allowed a hasty bandage, strapped her armour back on, mounted her horse, and rode straight back to the front line. The psychological impact was devastating. The English defenders looked down from their parapets and saw the teenage girl they thought they had just killed, waving her white banner. Absolute terror swept through the English ranks. They genuinely believed they were fighting an immortal demon. Military historian Stephen W. Ritchie explains the mechanics of this collapse. The sight of her returning from a seemingly fatal wound shattered the English defenders. Their morale evaporated, replaced by a paralysing supernatural dread. The French army, whipped into an absolute religious frenzy, swarmed the walls. The English lines completely broke. The ruthless English commander, Sir William Glassdale, the man who had promised to slaughter every man, woman and child in Orléans, attempted to retreat across a burning wooden drawbridge. The burning timbers collapsed. Weighed down by 80 pounds of heavy steel plate armour, Glassdale plunged directly into the Loire River and drowned in the mud. The Tourelles fell. May 8th, 1429. The sun rose over a completely altered reality. The surviving English commanders, the Earl of Suffolk and Lord Talbot, rallied their remaining troops. They abandoned their surviving bastilles and marched onto the open plains north of the city. They formed a massive, highly disciplined battle line. They were ready for a decisive open-field slaughter to avenge the disaster at the Tourelles. The French army immediately marched out of the city gates to meet them. The two forces stood agonizingly close, separated by a few hundred yards of muddy ground. Tens of thousands of heavily armed men stared at each other in dead silence. A single loosed arrow, a shouted insult, or a panicked horse would have triggered a catastrophic melee. The veteran French generals gripped their weapons, waiting for Joan to order the charge. She did something completely incomprehensible instead. She explicitly forbade any offensive action. It was a Sunday. She ordered her priest to carry a portable wooden altar directly out onto the battlefield. Right there, in the mud, with thousands of English warbows aimed at her head, she forced the entire French vanguard to kneel and hear mass. The psychological pressure on the English line must have been suffocating. They were watching the teenage girl who had just butchered their garrison casually praying in their kill zone. The English High Command faced a crippling logistical reality. Their supply chains were severed, their primary siege forts were burning, and their men were utterly terrified of the witch in white armour. Historian Helen Castor summarises the sheer bizarre nature of this final confrontation. The English withdrew, not because their army was physically annihilated, but because their absolute psychological superiority had been entirely shattered. Talbot refused to give the order to fire. After an hour of agonizing silence, he ordered the English army to turn around. They marched away in absolute disgrace. Their retreat was so rushed and chaotic that they abandoned their massive, extremely expensive bronze siege cannons, known as bombards, sinking in the mud. They left behind their sick, their wounded, and their unburied dead. The 6-month strangulation of Orléans ended with a silent, humiliating walk of shame. The tide of the 100 Years' War permanently shifted that morning. A 17-year-old girl broke the greatest military machine in the world through sheer irrational willpower. The English retreat from Orléans on May 8th, 1429, was not just a tactical withdrawal. It was the total ideological collapse of their empire in France. The 100 Years' War instantly morphed from a cynical, bureaucratic dispute over feudal land rights into a terrifying, uncompromising holy war. The Siege of Orléans proved that superior military logistics, advanced asymmetric weapons, and seasoned veterans mean absolutely nothing when faced with an enemy entirely devoid of the fear of death. Joan did not just relieve a starving city, she resurrected a dead nation. In the weeks following the siege, she launched a blistering campaign across the Loire Valley. She obliterated the remaining English strongholds, culminating in the crushing victory at Patay, where the dreaded English longbowmen were slaughtered before they could even deploy. She then dragged a terrified, reluctant Charles VII deep into enemy territory to the cathedral at Rheims to be officially crowned King of France. Here is the brutal, unforgiving tragedy of her legacy. Her absolute success guaranteed her gruesome execution. The English and their Burgundian allies had to capture and destroy her. It was not mere military revenge, it was a desperate political necessity. If she was genuinely sent by God, it meant God actively hated the English cause. They needed to burn her as a heretic to legally invalidate Charles VII's crown. The silence of the French throne remains one of the most disgusting betrayals in medieval military history. When Joan was finally pulled off her horse and captured at Compiègne a year later, Charles VII did absolutely nothing. The man who owed his royal title, his wealth, and his kingdom to a teenage farm labourer refused to offer a single copper coin for her ransom. He abandoned her to the Inquisition. Kings despise owing their thrones to peasants, especially peasants who possess more courage than the entire royal court combined. On May 30th, 1431, she burned at the stake in Rouen. She was 19 years old. Joan of Arc remains an absolute anomaly. She strips away the comforting myth that history is shaped purely by economics, geography, or rational politics. She forces us to confront an uncomfortable psychological reality. Sometimes, absolute uncompromising fanaticism is the only force capable of shattering a paralysed world. If you found this deep dive into the brutal reality of medieval warfare eye-opening, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps push these forgotten histories to more people. Let me know in the comments if you want a full dedicated breakdown of Joan's trial and execution next. Thank you for watching, and keep questioning the history you've been taught.